August 17, 1942. Nautilus, USS submarine, 2,000 yards offshore Makin Atoll. The Pacific darkness held no moon that night. Beneath a canopy of stars so thick they seemed to press down upon the black water, two fleet submarines cut their engines to idle. The USS Nautilus and her sister vessel Argonaut sat suspended in the warm current, their hulls creaking softly as 18-foot swells rolled beneath them. Inside the Nautilus, 121 men prepared for something the United States Marine Corps had never attempted before. The air inside the submarine was thick, diesel fumes mixed with sweat, gun oil, and the metallic taste of fear that no amount of training could eliminate. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson stood in the cramped wardroom, his weathered face illuminated by a single overhead bulb. At 46, he was older than most combat commanders, his eyes carrying the weight of experience from guerrilla campaigns in China and Nicaragua. Around him, the raiders of the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion made final checks on weapons that seemed impossibly small for the task ahead. Springfield rifles, Thompson submachine guns, a few Browning automatic rifles. Against an enemy dug into coral fortifications on an island they'd never seen, defended by numbers they could only estimate. Before we continue this story of impossible courage, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that bell icon so you never miss these untold tales from World War II that changed history forever. Carlson's plan had been called many things in the halls of the Navy Department in Washington. Experimental, unorthodox, reckless. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, had been one of the few to support it, seeing in Carlson's proposal something the American public desperately needed in the summer of 1942, proof that the United States could strike back. But Captain James Roosevelt, the president's son and Carlson's executive officer, had heard the whispers from other commanders at Pearl Harbor. Pure suicide, one Navy captain had muttered. You're sending those boys to their graves. The mathematics seemed to support the skeptics. Intelligence estimates placed between 200 and 300 Japanese troops on Makin, a coral atoll barely rising above sea level in the Gilbert Islands. But intelligence had been wrong before, catastrophically wrong at Pearl Harbor just 8 months earlier. The 2nd Marine Raider Battalion would land with 221 men in total, split between two submarines, armed with weapons designed for a different kind of war. They would paddle to shore in flimsy rubber boats, wade through surf they'd never seen, cross beaches they'd studied only on grainy reconnaissance photographs, and assault fortified positions held by an enemy that had never known defeat. This was August 1942. The news from every front carried the taste of ashes. In Russia, German panzers rolled toward Stalingrad through fields of burning wheat. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps stood at the gates of Cairo. In the Pacific, the Japanese Empire stretched across an ocean, a wall of conquest from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, from the Aleutians to the Solomon Sea. American forces clung to Henderson Field on Guadalcanal by their fingernails, fighting for an airstrip carved from jungle mud while the Imperial Japanese Navy circled like sharks, waiting for the kill. The American public knew only loss. Wake Island had fallen. The Philippines had fallen. The Prince of Wales and Repulse, Britain's mightiest battleships, had been sunk by Japanese aircraft. Singapore, the great fortress of the East, had surrendered. Every week brought news of another Allied defeat, another island conquered, another army retreating. In movie theaters across America, newsreels showed Japanese soldiers marching through captured cities, their flags rising over territories that stretched across a quarter of the globe. The raiders in the Nautilus knew this. They felt it in the weight of the moment, in the absolute silence that had fallen over the submarine as H-hour approached. These were not the Marines of recruiting posters, not yet. They were volunteers, yes, handpicked from the 2nd Marine Division for an experiment in warfare that borrowed from British commandos, Chinese guerrillas, and Carlson's own unorthodox theories about democratic leadership. They trained for 6 months on the island of Jacques Farm, California, learning to kill with knives, to navigate by stars, to move silently through darkness. They'd practiced amphibious landings until their hands bled from rope burns and salt water. But practice was not this. At 0300 hours, the first rubber boats began their launch. The process was chaos barely controlled. Each boat, a flimsy affair of canvas and rubber, had to be manhandled through the submarine's torpedo loading hatch, inflated on the pitching deck, and lowered into swells that rose and fell 12 feet. Men climbed down after them, legs finding uncertain purchase on wet metal, arms clutching weapons and ammunition that grew heavier with each moment. Motors that were supposed to drive them ashore coughed, sputtered, died. In the darkness, boats drifted apart. The careful organization Carlson had planned dissolved into scattered groups of men paddling with their hands, their rifle butts, anything that could move them through water that seemed determined to push them back out to sea. Private First Class Howard Young crouched in his boat, his Springfield rifle wrapped in canvas against the salt spray, and watched the island approach. Butaritari, the main island of Makin Atoll, was a strip of darkness slightly darker than the sea, marked only by the silhouette of coconut palms against stars. Intelligence had said the Japanese garrison was small, understrength, probably a seaplane base crew and some construction workers. Intelligence had said the landing beaches were clear. Intelligence had said many things. What intelligence hadn't said, couldn't have known, was what those Japanese troops expected. In their fortified positions along the atoll, the men of the 5th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force had lived 8 months of unbroken victory. They'd seen the American fleet burning at Pearl Harbor. They'd heard the news from the Philippines, from Singapore, from Burma. They occupied these islands not as conquerors clinging to hostile territory but as the rightful inheritors of an empire that would last 1,000 years. Their training had taught them that Americans were soft, corrupted by luxury and democracy, incapable of the sacrifice and discipline that defined the Japanese warrior spirit. The first rubber boats touched sand at 0517 hours, 45 minutes behind schedule, and scattered across a mile of beach. Marines tumbled out into waist-deep water, weapons held high, expecting the hammer of machine gun fire that would turn the surf red. Instead, they found silence. The kind of silence that makes men crouch lower, that makes every breath sound like a shout. They waded ashore, boots finding purchase on coral that cut through canvas, and spread out in the darkness under coconut palms that rustled in the trade wind. Then the island woke up. The Japanese had not been sleeping. They'd heard the submarine engines, had seen the shapes on the water, had waited with the patience of men who knew their business. When they opened fire, it came from positions the Marines couldn't see. Pillboxes built from coconut logs and coral, firing slits that looked like shadows, machine guns positioned to create interlocking fields of fire that turned the beach into a killing ground. Private Young hit the sand as tracers cut the air above him, bright lines of red and green that seemed close enough to touch. The sound was unlike anything training had prepared him for, not the single crack of a rifle but a continuous roar, a wall of noise punctuated by the deeper bark of mortars and the scream of bullets ricocheting off coral. Around him, Marines were firing back at shadows, at muzzle flashes, at anything that might be the enemy. The smell of cordite mixed with coconut, with salt water, with blood. Carlson had planned for this moment, had trained his men in the tactics he called gung-ho, Chinese for work together. But plans dissolve in combat's chaos. The scattered landing had split the battalion into groups that couldn't see each other, couldn't coordinate, could barely hear orders shouted over the sustained crash of gunfire. Some boats were still out at sea, motors dead, men paddling frantically. Others had landed miles from their intended beach. The radio that was supposed to link Carlson to his companies had gone into the water during landing, ruined by salt spray. What the Japanese defenders expected was an enemy that would break under fire, that would retreat to their boats and flee. They'd been told Americans couldn't sustain casualties, couldn't stomach losses. They'd been told that democratic armies were weak armies, that men who voted for their leaders couldn't obey those leaders when death came calling. What they encountered instead was something different. Corporal Melvin Spots, a farm boy from Nebraska who'd enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, lay behind a fallen coconut palm and worked his Browning automatic rifle with mechanical precision. 20 rounds. Change magazine. 20 rounds. Change magazine. The rhythm was meditative, automatic. Around him, other Marines found their own rhythms. Thompson submachine guns chattered in short bursts. Springfield rifles cracked with careful, aimed fire. The chaos was organizing itself not from the top down but from the bottom up, small groups of men finding each other, forming fire teams, identifying targets and eliminating them with a speed and efficiency that caught the Japanese off guard. This was the first test of Carlson's unorthodox training methods. He'd abandoned traditional Marine Corps hierarchy in favor of something he'd seen in China with Mao's guerrillas. The principle that every man should understand the mission, that junior Marines should think for themselves, that initiative mattered more than rigid obedience. The other Marine commanders at Pearl Harbor had been scandalized. Officers held bull sessions where privates could question decisions. Men voted on company matters. It was practically communist, they said. It would destroy discipline. But on Macon's beaches, as scattered squads worked their way inland without officers to guide them, without radios to coordinate them, it was this training that kept them alive. Sergeant Clyde Thomason, a Texas oil worker who'd never finished high school, found himself leading a mixed group of men from 3 different companies. He didn't wait for orders that couldn't come. He identified a Japanese machine gun position firing from a fortified emplacement, organized his men into a base of fire and a flanking element, and assaulted the position with grenades and bayonets. The Japanese fought to the last man as they would throughout the day, but the position fell. By 0800 hours, after 3 hours of continuous combat, the Marines held a tenuous foothold on the island. They'd pushed inland from the beach, captured a Japanese truck, the first enemy vehicle taken by American forces in the war, and were advancing on what intelligence had identified as the main Japanese positions. The cost had been steep. Bodies lay on the beach, some in Marine dungarees, more in Japanese khaki. The pristine coral sand was no longer pristine. Carlson, who'd finally reached shore in the second wave, established a command post under a grove of coconut palms and tried to piece together what was happening. Reports came in fragments, carried by runners who sprinted between positions through sniper fire. Company A had captured a Japanese seaplane base. Company B was engaged with heavy resistance near the island's main dock. The radio operator was still trying to raise the submarines, to report success or failure, to call for naval gunfire support that might tip the balance. What Carlson didn't know, couldn't have known, was that he'd stumbled into something larger than intelligence had suggested. The Japanese garrison on Macon wasn't 200 men. It was closer to 600, 2 full companies of Special Naval Landing Forces, elite troops equivalent to Marines, dug into positions they'd spent months fortifying. The Marines were outnumbered nearly 3-1, deep in enemy territory, with no reinforcements and no easy way to retreat. By midday, the battle had settled into a brutal pattern. The Japanese would counterattack from prepared positions, coming in waves with fixed bayonets, screaming "Banzai!" in charges that sought to overwhelm through sheer ferocity. The Marines would meet them with concentrated fire, would let them come close, closer than training said to let them come, and would cut them down with automatic weapons fired at ranges measured in yards. Then the Japanese would fall back, regroup, and come again. Private First Class Ben Carson, a 19-year-old from Ohio, crouched in a shell crater with his Springfield and counted his ammunition. 40 rounds left. The man next to him had 20. They'd been fighting for 7 hours, and the sun had turned the island into a furnace. The temperature climbed past 100 degrees. There was no fresh water except what they'd carried in canteens now empty. Their tongues swelled. Their lips cracked and bled. When they spoke, their voices were whispers. But they held. The Japanese troops, exhausted and decimated, couldn't understand what they were facing. American soldiers were supposed to be soft, corrupted by comfort and prosperity. These men had come from a nation where every citizen had a car, where food was abundant, where life was easy. Japanese training films had shown American soldiers as tall and fat, slow-moving, dependent on machines and luxury. The warrior spirit, the willingness to die for the emperor, was supposed to be unique to Japan. Yet here were American troops who not only didn't break but couldn't be broken. They advanced under fire. They held positions against overwhelming counterattacks. When they ran low on ammunition, they used captured Japanese weapons. When they ran out of grenades, they improvised explosives from whatever they could find. They didn't surrender, didn't retreat, didn't even slow down. What the Japanese didn't see, couldn't see was what motivated these men. They weren't fighting for an emperor or an ideology. They were fighting for each other, for the men crouched next to them in the quarrel, for the brothers and fathers and sons who'd stood beside them through 6 months of training. They were fighting to prove something to themselves, to their country, to an enemy that had seemed invincible since Pearl Harbor. And they were fighting with a peculiarly American stubbornness, the kind that comes from a nation built by people who'd crossed oceans and mountains simply because they were told something was impossible. By 1400 hours, the Marines had pushed the Japanese back to the island's lagoon side. The initial defensive positions were captured. The seaplane base was destroyed. Japanese bodies littered the battlefield in numbers that seemed impossible given the small size of the raiding force. Carlson counted the cost: 18 Marines killed, 12 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation. Against that, his men had killed an estimated 160 Japanese troops, had destroyed 2 seaplanes, had burned fuel dumps and supply depots, had proven that American forces could land on a defended enemy island and win. But the battle wasn't over. At 1530 hours, a Japanese floatplane appeared over the island, circling lazily in the clear afternoon sky. It dropped no bombs, fired no shots. It simply observed, took photographs, and flew away. Carlson watched it go and felt a cold certainty settle into his gut. Reinforcements were coming. The Japanese garrison at Jalowit, 250 miles south, would have received word of the attack. Japanese patrol bombers would be taking off. Destroyers would be weighing anchor. The Marines had perhaps hours, perhaps only minutes, before the situation shifted from difficult to impossible. The decision to withdraw came at 1700 hours. The submarines, lying submerged offshore, surfaced briefly to receive Carlson's radio message. The pickup would happen at 1930 hours, after dark, at the same beaches where they'd landed. The Marines would have to cross back over ground they'd fought across, carrying their dead and wounded, pursued by an enemy that now knew exactly where they were. The withdrawal was worse than the landing. Japanese snipers had infiltrated back into positions the Marines thought they'd cleared. Every coconut palm might hide an enemy soldier. Every shadow might explode into gunfire. The rubber boats, battered by 12 hours in the surf, leaked and tore. Motors that had failed during landing failed again. Men paddled with their hands until their palms bled, pushed boats through surf that seemed determined to drive them back onto the beach, and watched the horizon for the shapes of Japanese aircraft that could turn the water into a death trap. Private Young made it to a boat on the 3rd trip. He'd spent the day fighting, had fired every round he carried, had helped carry Sergeant Thomason's body. Thomason had died charging a machine gun nest, had taken 3 bullets but kept moving until he reached the position and killed the crew with grenades. Now Young sat in the leaking boat, water rising around his ankles, and paddled with his rifle, but while tracers from the beach occasionally reached out toward them, falling short in towers of spray that glowed phosphorescent in the darkness. Not everyone made it out. 9 Marines were left behind in the confusion, some dead, some wounded and unable to reach the boats, some simply separated in the darkness and the chaos. The submarines waited as long as they dared, but as midnight approached and Japanese patrol bombers were reported overhead, they had no choice but to dive and run. The raiders who'd survived lay on the submarine decks, still wearing coral dust and blood, and felt the deck tilt as the boat slid beneath the Pacific surface. The raid on Makin Island had lasted 17 hours. The Marines had killed between 160 and 350 Japanese troops, estimates varied, but even the conservative numbers represented an exchange ratio unprecedented in the Pacific War's early months. They destroyed a seaplane base, captured documents that provided valuable intelligence, and proven something that military strategists in Washington and Tokyo were still trying to calculate. American troops, properly trained and led, could not only match the Japanese soldier but could overwhelm him. The news reached the United States on August 20, 1942. Newspapers ran with headlines that screamed victory in a war that had known only defeat. Marines raid Jap base, the New York Times announced. Tokyo rocked by daring attack. Radio broadcasts carried Carlson's name into living rooms across America, transforming him overnight from an obscure lieutenant colonel into a national hero. The public, starved for good news after 8 months of catastrophe, seized on Macon as proof that the tide was turning, that American boys could fight and win. But in the quiet corners of the Navy Department, in after-action reports that wouldn't be declassified for decades, analysts studied Macon with more critical eyes. The raid had cost 18 Marines killed and 12 wounded, an 18% casualty rate. 9 men had been left behind, captured by the Japanese and later executed. The submarines had been put at risk, had nearly been caught on the surface by enemy aircraft. For what? The propaganda victory, yes. A boost to morale, certainly. But strategically, Macon achieved little that couldn't have been achieved with less risk. What these analysts missed, what couldn't be measured in casualty reports or strategic assessments, was what Macon meant to the Japanese. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff received reports of the raid with confusion that turned to concern. How had American forces penetrated the defensive perimeter? How had such a small force inflicted such disproportionate casualties? How had American troops, supposedly soft and weak, fought with such determination? The raid forced a diversion of resources. Troops that were needed at Guadalcanal were instead sent to garrison islands throughout the Pacific. Defenses were strengthened. Patrols were increased. The psychological impact of Macon, of knowing that no island was truly safe, was incalculable. For the Japanese soldiers who survived Macon, the experience was transformative. They'd been taught that the American soldier was inferior, that victory was assured by Japanese spiritual superiority. They'd faced an enemy they expected to break and instead had been systematically destroyed. Reports from Macon filtered through the Imperial Japanese Navy whispered accounts of Americans who'd fought hand-to-hand, who'd charged into machine gun fire, who'd shown a ferocity that contradicted every assumption about democratic armies. The Americans, the survivors said, had fought like demons. What these Japanese soldiers encountered on Macon's beaches was something their training hadn't prepared them for. American abundance translated into military power. The Marines who'd landed on Macon carried more ammunition than Japanese soldiers thought possible. Their automatic weapons, Browning automatic rifles and Thompson submachine guns, provided a base of fire that Japanese formations couldn't match. When ammunition ran low, they'd call for resupply, and rubber boats would brave the surf to bring more. The Japanese, trained in a philosophy of scarcity, of making every bullet count, of accepting death when supplies ran out, couldn't comprehend an enemy for whom running out of ammunition was a problem to be solved rather than an inevitable fate to be accepted. This abundance had a symbol, small and easily overlooked: the sea ration. Every Marine carried them, canned food in olive drab tins, crackers wrapped in waxed paper, cigarettes, coffee, sugar, even chewing gum. They were heavy, adding pounds to packs already loaded with ammunition and gear. But they meant a Marine could fight all day without hunger weakening his arms, without thirst clouding his judgment. The Japanese soldiers on Macon, by contrast, fought with rice balls that had gone sour in the heat, with water supplies that were quickly exhausted. After the battle, Marines searching Japanese positions found rice stores, carefully rationed, measured out to last weeks if necessary. They found personal items that spoke of scarcity, soldiers carrying needles and thread to repair uniforms worn thin, letters written on paper so fine it was nearly transparent. In American terms, the Japanese garrison was supplied like men expecting to be forgotten, to hold alone, to die if necessary without hope of resupply or reinforcement. The contrast was ideological as much as material. The Japanese soldier was taught that sacrifice was the highest virtue, that death in battle was the ultimate honor. Surrender was unthinkable, retreat shameful, survival without victory a form of disgrace. This philosophy created warriors of extraordinary courage, men who would charge into certain death, who would fight to the last bullet and then to the last grenade and then with bayonets and bare hands. But it also created a fragility that the Japanese high command didn't recognize until too late. An army built on the expectation of death cannot easily adapt when death comes in overwhelming numbers. The Japanese troops on Macon fought with incredible bravery, but once their defensive positions were broken, once casualties mounted beyond certain thresholds, there was no doctrine for what came next. There was only death, embrace it with honor. The Americans, by contrast, fought to win and to survive. This wasn't cowardice, The casualty rates at Macon proved that. It was a different philosophy, one that valued the individual soldier not just as a weapon to be expended but as a citizen who would return home, who had a life beyond the war. This created an army that fought differently, that sought tactical advantage and superior firepower, that valued cleverness and initiative, that would retreat when retreat made sense and attack when attack could succeed. Throughout the rest of 1942 and into 1943, the lessons of Macon rippled through both militaries. The Marine Raiders became a symbol of American offensive spirit, spawning additional Raider battalions and influencing tactics throughout the Pacific. Carlson's methods, the democratic leadership style, the emphasis on small unit initiative, the rigorous physical training, were studied and, gradually, incorporated into standard Marine Corps doctrine. For the Japanese, Macon was an early warning they largely ignored. The Imperial General Staff, flush with victories from Pearl Harbor to Singapore, saw Macon as an aberration, a lucky strike against an undermanned garrison. They didn't adjust their estimates of American fighting quality. They didn't rethink their assumptions about democratic weakness. They continued planning offensives, continued believing in the superiority of Japanese warrior spirit over American material abundance. This was their mistake, and it would cost them an empire. The men who raided Macon carried the experience with them through the rest of the war. Some, like Major James Roosevelt, would survive to command larger formations, to participate in Guadalcanal's grinding campaign, to see the Pacific War through to its end. Others, like Sergeant Thomason, were dead within hours of landing, their bodies buried on a coral atoll that would see more fighting, more death, before the war moved on. Private First Class Young survived the war, returned to Ohio, married, raised children who knew only fragments of what their father had done on an August night in 1942. He kept a piece of coral in a desk drawer, a chunk of white stone that had turned red that day, that he'd picked up during the withdrawal and carried through the surf to the submarine. Sometimes he'd hold it, feel its rough surface, and remember what it felt like to be 19 years old and discover that you were capable of things you'd never imagined. In the decades after the war, historians would debate Macon's significance. Some called it a costly mistake, a raid that achieved little and cost too much. Others saw it as a crucial turning point, the moment when American morale shifted from defensive despair to offensive confidence. Both views carried truth, both missed something essential. What Macon proved wasn't measurable in strategic objectives achieved or casualties inflicted. It proved something more fundamental, that the American soldier, given proper training and leadership, could match and exceed any enemy in the world. That democracy didn't make men weak but strong, that freedom was worth fighting for because men who fought for freedom fought differently than men who fought for empire. The Japanese had built an ideology around scarcity and sacrifice, around the belief that spiritual purity and willingness to die could overcome material disadvantage. They'd created warriors of extraordinary courage who faced death without flinching. But courage alone wasn't enough. Ideology alone wasn't enough. The will to die, divorced from the means to fight effectively, became a form of waste, of young men thrown away in charges that accomplished nothing except to fill graves. The Americans brought abundance to war. They brought more bullets, more food, more equipment, more of everything. But they also brought something else, the belief that every soldier mattered, that victory should be achieved with minimum loss, that cleverness and firepower should substitute for suicidal courage whenever possible. This wasn't cowardice. It was respect for life, even in the context of war. On Macon Island, in 17 hours of savage combat, these two philosophies collided. The Japanese expected American troops to break, to run, to prove the superiority of Japanese training and spirit. Instead, they encountered men who fought with a determination born not from orders or ideology but from something simpler, the refusal to let down the men fighting beside them, the stubborn conviction that they could win if they just kept moving forward, the knowledge that they were fighting for something real, homes and families and a future that existed beyond the battlefield. The plan had been called suicide. The commanders who'd opposed it had been certain it would end in disaster. Instead, it became a template, a proof of concept that would be refined and repeated across the Pacific. From Tarawa to Iwo Jima, from Peleliu to Okinawa, American forces would conduct amphibious assaults against fortified islands, would accept terrible casualties, would fight enemies who never surrendered and never quit. And they would win not because they were willing to die, but because they were determined to live and to ensure that their sacrifice meant something. The coral beaches of Macon, white sand turned red on an August morning, stand now empty. The coconut palms still rustle in the trade wind. The sea still pounds the reef with the same rhythm it kept in 1942. Time has erased the foxholes, has scattered the bullet casings, has reduced the fortifications to mounds of coral slowly being reclaimed by jungle. But what happened there echoes still. In the history of how democracies wage war, in the evolution of amphibious warfare, in the transformation of the Marine Corps from a small colonial force into the instrument that would island hop across the Pacific to Japan's doorstep. One raid, one battalion, one night in August 1942 when 221 men proved that the impossible was just another operation, another mission, another day's work for those who refused to accept defeat. The commanders called it suicide. The veterans called it Macon. History would call it the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire, the first crack in a defensive perimeter that would fracture and collapse under the weight of American industrial might and the courage of young men who discovered on a coral atoll that they were capable of anything. In the quiet moments, in the spaces between official histories and strategic analyses, perhaps that's what matters most. Not the tonnage destroyed or the casualties inflicted or the propaganda value achieved, but the simple fact that ordinary American boys, farm kids from Nebraska, oil workers from Texas, factory hands from Ohio, faced an enemy that had conquered half an ocean and said, simply no. Not here. Not today. Not ever again. And they meant it.